Hi everyone. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of spending some time with Dr. Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli historian most known for his work about the year 1948. He got his PhD at the University of Oxford in 1984 and is now a professor at the University of Exeter, where he established the very first European Center for Palestinian Studies in 2009. In 2006, Pappé published his critically acclaimed book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. The book was finally translated into Czech in June 2024, and he came to Prague for its release. This is how I got the opportunity to meet him, and in 3 days I attended all 3 of his lectures. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me, and I wanted to share it with all of you. So I compiled my notes, and I made this video. This video is going to primarily focus on 1948, and I'm going to do that for 2 reasons. Number 1, 1948 is Ilan Pappé's area of expertise. When he was asked why specifically he chose this year as an area of study, Ilan Pappé said it was pretty simple. He was a boy who grew up in Israel, and he was a history nerd, so it was natural for him to be interested in the year of his country's independence. Also, when Ilan Pappé was beginning his studies in the late 70s, a lot of documents from Israel, the UK, and elsewhere about 1948 were being declassified, and so people like Ilan Pappé were the very first to get to study them. Reason number 2 is a little sadder. Though the Zionist project predates 1948, this was the first year that they could and did enact the ethnic cleansing part of their plan. And considering what we're seeing today, I think it's important for us to understand how and why this first occurred. So, without further ado, let's begin.
Part 1. Zionism.
Okay, so I know that I said I'm going to primarily focus on 1948, but I think I need to lay a little bit of groundwork so we can fully grasp the Zionist project, which is Israel. So I'm going to give the briefest summary I can of Zionism and how it was promoted. Zionism is an ethno-nationalist movement that emerged from Europe in the late 1800s. What do I mean by ethno-nationalist? Well, by ethno, I mean the Jewish people. Not as followers of a religion, but as a separate race of people. What do I mean by race? Well, in the late 1800s, race science was very en vogue. Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, was not religious at all, but he faced anti-Semitism because he was born to a Jewish family in Europe. So, if he could argue that his race made him distinct from the rest of European society, he could then argue that this race of people should have special considerations. And by nationalist, I mean that this race of people needed a country for themselves. So, by ethno-nationalist, I mean a country needed for the Jewish race. Zionism is also a settler colonial movement, meaning that in order to create the country they wanted, they would need to move to the place that they wanted a country, build up settlements there, colonize the people already living there, and, when they had enough settlers, establish the state of Israel. So where should this new homeland be? The early Zionists debated Uganda, they debated Argentina, they even briefly considered Cyprus, but after much deliberation, the early Zionists concluded that their new homeland would be in Palestine! Yay! Now to us, in 2024, this sounds bonkers. You can't just move a bunch of people to a new place where people are already living and say, "This is mine now." But this is the 1890s, and settler colonialism was also very en vogue. The UK had settler colonialism, France had settler colonialism, Belgium and Spain and Portugal and Japan and China and the Netherlands and the US had settler colonialism. Why shouldn't the Jews? In the case of all settler colonial movements, there are 2 key things that need to be addressed. 1, the space they want to take and how they will take it, and 2, the population already living in that space and how they will conquer them. So space and population. Got it? Good. In the cases of Australia and the United States, they answer number 2 the same way. Genocide. Wipe out the population almost entirely, and you won't have a problem with them fighting back. Now, by the time Zionism was launching its political movement, the international community was beginning to realize that genocide is kind of bad, actually. The Zionists came to the settler colonial games a little too late for that. So the Zionists would then need to adopt a slightly less bad solution to the population problem: ethnic cleansing. But they wouldn't be able to act upon it for a few decades. But as is the case with anything substantial, before you can do it, you need to dream it. So what proof do we have that the early Zionists dreamed of ethnic cleansing? Well, to understand the proof, we need to understand that most early Zionists were not Jewish. Most Jewish people weren't Zionists before World War II, and especially not before World War I. Zionists were a small minority in the Jewish population worldwide. So, who were these early Zionists? Well, they were Christians. Specifically evangelical Protestant Christians. Specifically evangelical Protestant Christians in the US and the UK who believed in the rapture. If you would like to hear more about it, I suggest you listen to the evangelical section of the video here. Ilan Pappé has done far more research into the origins of the topic than I have. Long story short, these people believe that the end times are coming, and that a sign of these end times is the Jews controlling the biblically historical land of Israel, and that they need to be in a holy war there in order for Jesus Christ to come back. Basically, the Jews are pawns at the beginning of the end, the first to die so that the Christian Savior can return. Sounds crazy, right? Who would believe in this nonsense? Well, I did. I was raised Christian Zionist, and a lot of people in the UK and the US are still raised this way today. This belief was growing tremendously in the 19th century, and some deeply religious Protestant Christians were willing to pay for artists to go on excursions to the Holy Land to capture the landscape of where this rapture is to occur. Enter D. Appleton of New York City and James S. Virtue of London, two publishing firms with deep Protestant Christian convictions, who paid artists Henry Fenn and John Douglas Woodward to travel to Palestine and paint the landscape. Their works would be published in Picturesque Palestine, a series published between 1881 and 1883. There's something particular I want you to notice in the works of Henry Fenn, John Douglas Woodward, and similar artists during this time. They paint the landscape of Palestine as a beautiful, tranquil, empty desert with few to no people, no villages, no civilization, nothing. Besides Jerusalem, there's nothing there, and so going to make a homeland of it isn't that big of a deal. There's an early Zionist saying that goes, "A land without a people for a people without a land." These paintings literally painted that sentiment, and it is simply not true.
It is, in fact, entirely historically inaccurate. The proof is in the picture. This land is empty. There's no one we're taking it from. A land without a people for a people without a land. Here is our proof of the early Zionists fulfilling their settler colonialist dream. It's a perfect, picturesque painting. It's not true. To get this land, you're going to have to kill a lot of people already living there, but we'll worry about that later.
And yet, this sentiment is still reinforced to this day. For example, in April of 2023, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, praised Israel for 75 years of existence, stating that she respects the way
you have literally made the desert bloom.
This statement, that Palestine before Israel was an empty desert with no blooms to speak of, is propaganda. It's Zionist propaganda. So, in the rest of this video, we'll uncover how the ethno-nationalist settler colonialist movement of Zionism came to answer these two questions. How do we get the land that we want, and what do we do with the population already there?
Part 2. The Nakba. On October 5th, 1937, David Ben-Gurion, a Polish immigrant to Israel, wrote a letter to his son. Ben-Gurion would later become Israel's first prime minister.
In this letter, he specifically addresses settler colonialism issue 1, getting the land they want. He states,
"How can this land become ours? The decisive question is, does the establishment of a Jewish state in only part of Palestine advance or retard the conversion of this country into a Jewish country? My assumption, which is why I'm a fervent proponent of a state, even though it is now linked to partition, is that a Jewish state in only part of the country is not the end, but the beginning. It does not hurt our feelings that by this acquisition we are not in possession of the whole land. This is because this increase in possession is of consequence not only in itself, but because through it we increase our strength. And every increase in strength helps in the possession of the land as a whole."
10 years later, in February 1947, the UN appointed the UN Special Committee of Palestine, UNSCOP, with 11 member states, many of whom knew very little about Palestine, and even less of whom had ever been to Palestine. The idea was to figure out what to do with Palestine once the British mandate ended. In other mandates in the area, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, they were expecting foreign forces to leave, to then have democratic elections by the people in those areas, and to enact their right to self-determination as protected by the United Nations. The right to self-determination is articulated in Article 1 of Chapter 1 of the UN Charter. However, the right to self-determination was never considered for the Palestinian people. Instead, UNSCOP was to devise a way to satisfy both Palestinian and Zionist demands in the region without democratic elections. The American delegation to the UN suggested a 5-year trusteeship of Palestine, basically suggesting that the UN control Palestine for 5 more years while all parties try to reach a fair agreement. Palestine agreed to this idea, but the Zionists were not keen to do so. So, the Zionist lobby in the U.S. pressured Americans to withdraw their support of this idea, and soon after, they did. So instead, UNSCOP proposed the Partition Plan of Palestine, and on November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted that plan as Resolution 181. The plan recommended an independent Arab state taking 44% of the land and an independent Jewish state taking 56% of the land, with Jerusalem and its surrounding areas being an international zone. The problem with this plan was that the region was roughly 33% Jewish and 66% Palestinian. And so the Arab states of the UN rejected this plan, and the Palestinians took to the streets and began to fight. I am personally unsure how it could have been read differently. 33% of the people who had moved there recently get over half the land. How is that fair? How is that not something the Palestinians would fight against? And so they fought. By January 1948, Dr. Pappé estimates that roughly 400 Jews and 1,500 Palestinians were killed. But the Zionist forces were fighting on the defensive, and that had to change. And so, in March 1948, the Zionists contrived Plan Dalet, Dalet being the 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, i.e. Plan D. The plan was spearheaded by soon-to-be First Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. The plan was meant to put the Zionists on the offensive side of the war by first reorganizing the Haganah, the Zionist paramilitary force that would later become the Israel Defense Force, or IDF, and bolster the military by making conscription into the army mandatory for all Jews, men and women included. This army was to fight not only in this current war, but in all future wars anticipated to inevitably come. Furthermore, the plan called for the establishment of the Jewish state and for all Palestinian cities and villages within the Jewish borders of the Partition Plan to be conquered, liquidated, and/or destroyed. The plan worked. Plan Dalet was first enacted in April 1948. On April 9th, the Zionist forces committed the Deir Yassin massacre, a massacre in which at least 107 people in the Deir Yassin village were killed, men, women, and children. Ilan Pappé states,
"The systematic nature of Plan Dalet is manifested in Deir Yassin, a pastoral and cordial village that had reached a non-aggression pact with the Haganah in Jerusalem, but was doomed to be wiped out because it was within the areas designated in Plan Dalet to be cleansed.
This was the moment that Palestinian people realized they were in grave danger, that even a village that had pled peace with the Zionist forces was subject to massacre, that even civilians would be targeted en masse. This was the moment that many Palestinian people began to flee Palestine. This was the moment that the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, had officially begun. The Zionist forces would then invade the Palestinian cities of Tiberias, Tantura, Haifa, Jaffa, Safed, Baisan, and Acre. In total, 11 entire cities and over 500 villages would be liquidated and or destroyed in a process Ilan Pappé dubs urbancide. Essentially, these cities were targeted not only because they fell within the Jewish borders of the Partition Plan, but because their destruction played a key role in the Zionist project. If you destroy the elite, it is much easier to destroy the rest. In this urbancide process, roughly 250,000 Palestinians fled the region. Up until this point, the British were technically still in control. But this changed on May 14, 1948, when Israel claimed its independence and officially became a state. The British wiped their hands of the situation and left. Because the British were no longer in charge of the region's security, what level of violence was acceptable was now in the hands of Israel. They now had the full capacity to enact ethnic cleansing. Who was going to stop them? The following day, May 15th, the surrounding Arab states declared war on Israel. Most of the Arab soldiers came from Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, and they came to fight for Palestine, mostly reluctantly. They weren't too keen on fighting a country backed by superpowers like the British and the Americans. But they also couldn't idly accept hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fleeing their homes and describing the destruction. So they did what they thought they had to do. This marks the official beginning of the Nakba. The irony of it all is that Plan Dalet was seen as justified by the Zionist forces because these Palestinian cities and villages resided in the Jewish area of the Partition Plan. But the Partition Plan was never put into place. There never was an independent Palestine. The darkest chapter of the Nakba came in October 1948, when the Israeli forces attacked the north of Galilee in Operation Hiram. Operation Hiram was particularly violent because the Palestinians knew what was coming, and so they put up a strong resistance, which was brutally crushed. The attack was so brutal that even Jewish leaders in the surrounding communities wrote in their diaries that what the Israelis did in October 48 was not that different from what the Nazis did in World War II. And so, in 9 months, half of Palestine's population was expelled. 750,000 people were now refugees, expelled from their ancestral homes. Roughly half of Palestine's villages were demolished, and nearly all cities and towns were destroyed. Along with 4,000 Israeli soldiers and 2,000 Israeli civilians, nearly 15,000 Palestinians were dead. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the Nakba as a historical event. And while it is crucial to understand the historical event that is the Nakba, it is equally important to bear in mind that this process, this establishing of Jewish settlements on Palestinian land, this driving out of Palestinians from their homes, this killing of Palestinians by the thousands, this demolishing and erasing of Palestine, this never ended. This has been in continuation since 1948. Some waves deadlier than others, this current wave being the deadliest we have ever seen. This is what we mean when we say the Nakba never ended. The Nakba never ended because Israeli settler colonialism persists to this day. To give an example of how we can see the effects of the Nakba today, 70% of Gazans are descendants of the Nakba. They weren't from Gaza before then. They were forced to move there. And so, all of this blew Ilan Pappé's mind. It contradicted everything he knew, everything that he was taught in school and by his family and in university and in the public domain. But there was evidence, so much evidence, to prove the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I'm going to share this link in the description where you can see the archives of the proof for yourself. So how is it possible that Ilan Pappé was learning things that contradicted everything he knew? Well, here's the catch. Ilan Pappé did not do his doctoral studies in Israel. He was outside Israel, in the UK, and he was thus privy to information that he may have never had access to had he studied within Israel. Furthermore, at Oxford, this was the first time in Pappé's life that he was meeting with Palestinian academics on equal footing. This was not possible in Israel. His doctoral advisor was Arab. This was not possible in Israel. He could not meet Arab people on an equal level in an Israeli academic setting. And so, with this open environment, and with this new information, and with this equal playing field, Ilan Pappé was able to discern what really happened in 1948.
Part 3. Counternarrative. What happens next, I relate to so deeply. When Ilan Pappé finished his doctorate, he was excited. He was young, full of energy, and deeply dedicated to his studies. He was excited to go back home and to share with people what he had learned. Wouldn't they, too, want to know the truth of what really happened in their country? Wouldn't they also want to know the contradictions in what they were being taught? At this time, Ilan Pappé describes himself as naive. He went back home and he told people what he had learned, and they told him to shut the fuck up. They told him that he was wrong. They told him that they had a legitimate alternative narrative to what happened in 1948. So, what is this alternative narrative? Number one, in a nutshell, the 1948 Arab-Israeli war was a defensive war where the Israelis fought against all odds to protect their right to self-determination. They were immediately attacked by their neighbors after declaring their independence, and they needed to protect the lands granted to them in the 1947 Partition Plan. Number two, it's the Arabs' fault for rejecting the Partition Plan. If they had just accepted the plan, Palestine could have been a state and there would have been no need for war. They brought this war upon themselves by rejecting the Partition Plan and declaring war against Israel. And yes, with this war came the displacement of Palestinians, but they would have had a place to go had the Arabs accepted the Partition Plan. And some Palestinians even left voluntarily. It's overblown to say that they were all forcibly displaced. Number three, what about the Jewish refugees fleeing persecution from the Arab countries? Didn't they need a place to go? Number four, why shouldn't the Jews be allowed to go to a place that was promised to them by the UN in the Partition Plan, by the British in the Balfour Declaration, and by God in the Old Testament? Number five, don't you remember the Holocaust? It just happened. Don't you see why the Jews need a safe place to go? The Jews need their own state so another Holocaust won't happen to them, and the United Nations can see that. That's why they helped create the Jewish state of Israel. Okay, this narrative is compelling for those who support a Jewish state, but it has some major problems. Let's go through them point by point. Starting with number one, 1948 was a defensive war. If the 1948 Arab-Israeli War was a war in which Israel was on the defensive, attacked by all sides,
Then why did Zionist forces begin the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians before the declaration of war? Plan Dalet was thought up in March 1948 and put into action in April 1948. Israel's creation and the subsequent declaration of war against Israel didn't come until mid-May. By the time Israel was created, 250,000 Palestinians, mostly city dwellers, had already been forced to flee. To which a Zionist might say, well, the Palestinians began attacking us all the way back in November. They started it. They were the aggressors. To which I would respond, why is it that when Israel fights for their right to self-determination, it is right and just? But when the Palestinians fight for their right to self-determination, it is an unjustified, aggressive attack. They began fighting in November 1947 because the UN stripped them of their right to democratic self-determination. What exactly is the difference here? Furthermore, while some Arab nations did fight in earnest in 1948, a notable exception to this is Jordan. Jordan supplied up to 10,000 soldiers, the second most Arab soldiers in the war, second only to Egypt. The problem with these soldiers, though, is that they had no intention of defeating Israel, because King Abdullah of Jordan was colluding with the Zionists behind closed doors. Avi Shlaim, a British-Israeli historian, pored over the declassified documents in Israel, the US, and the UK and published a whopping 700-page book entitled Collusion Across the Jordan. Shlaim details how King Abdullah had secret talks with Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and decided that he would publicly fight for Palestine, but not really fight. And in exchange, Israel would let Jordan annex the West Bank. Unfortunately, King Abdullah was assassinated in 1951, so he never got the West Bank. But he did secretly help Israel conquer Palestine. So, yes, Palestinian people and Arab nations were fighting Zionist forces and later Israel in 1948. But the Palestinians were fighting against a partition plan that they had no say in and that they rightly found unfair. A significant portion of Arab soldiers were in cahoots with Israel and not fighting with genuine intent. And lastly, the Zionists began their campaign of ethnic cleansing months before Israel became a state, months before the declaration of war. To me, that doesn't sound like self-defense. Now, to give some credit, in the early days of Zionism, I can understand the argument of self-defense. The first Jewish Zionists moved to Palestine in 1881, 1882, and they were a teeny-weeny minority in a land of mostly Arab people. Not only that, but a lot of these early Zionists were escaping rampant anti-Semitism and pogroms in Eastern Europe, notably the Kiev pogrom of 1881. These people were scared. These people were facing persecution. These people were moving to a totally foreign land in very small numbers. The concept of self-defense and self-preservation were likely integral in their psyche, things that helped them survive this far, things that they still held on to whether or not they still needed to. I get that. But come 1948, when they're a third of the population with immense international support and with official claims to 56% of the land, I get it a lot less.
Argument 2. The Arabs brought this war on themselves by rejecting the Partition Plan. So I'm going to go ahead and just say it. Justifying what happened to the Palestinians because the Arabs rejected the Partition Plan is ludicrous. The plan gave away half their land and they found that unfair, so they rejected it and fought against it. Okay, that doesn't mean that they deserve to be brutally massacred, that they asked for it by standing up for themselves. Let's imagine a stranger unexpectedly moving into your house. You and your spouse, 66% of the house's inhabitants now say, You can't do that. This is our house. But the stranger insists that God and the UN said that they were allowed to move in. Fine. Now imagine that the stranger takes over half, 56% of the house, and says it belongs to them and only them. You and your spouse need to stay in the smaller part of the house. You would say, no, that's not fair. You can't do that. I don't accept that. And you push them away. Then the stranger punches you in the face, burns all of your things in their half of the house, and says, oh, look what you made me do. I wouldn't have to destroy all your things if you had just given me my half of the house like I asked. Why do you have to make things so difficult? It's ridiculous, right? It's ridiculous to think that the Palestinians would have been okay with this plan. So to abuse them, to displace them, to massacre them because they didn't go along with it, that's irrational at best. Not only that, but I'm wary of any justification for massacring innocent people. Like, we can have a whole conversation on whether or not it's just to kill someone who is fighting you. Fine. But to kill people, including children who are not fighting you, to massacre villages that have a peace agreement with you, to displace people en masse simply because they are now in the wrong spot, then to deny that it happened at all? No. To me, that's not something worth taking the time or effort to justify. Now, to claim that some Palestinians left of their own volition is wild. Of course, the nature of how these people fled their homes varied. Some of them were kicked out by gunpoint or by the end of a bayonet, but not all of them were. Some of them merely saw their house burned down or their neighbors murdered or the neighboring village leveled to the ground and then decided to leave of their own volition. I hope that you can see how this argument is entirely devoid of good faith.
Some Zionists go so far as to say that the Palestinians were told to leave by some leaders in the Arab world. However, this claim is so patently untrue that even Benny Morris, an Israeli historian who loves to stan Zionism, has said that it's a myth.
Neighboring Arab countries were heavily criticized by Zionists for not taking in more Palestinian refugees. If the Arabs were so concerned with these 750,000 people kicked out of their homes, why didn't they offer them new homes? This is a classic deflection tactic. It shifts the focus from the root of the problem, the mass expulsion of the Palestinians, to a symptom of the problem, these people now needing homes. If the Zionists were truly concerned about this problem, why wouldn't they just offer the Palestinian their homes back? The homes they still have the keys to. So, no, I don't buy that Zionists were concerned with Palestinian refugees at all. If they were, they wouldn't have made them refugees. At the bottom of this argument is a Zionist echo that we have heard time and time again throughout the decades. Look what you made us do. Look what you made us do because you were hostile toward us. And it fails every time to address the root of the hostility. They'll say it's because Arabs are just barbaric Jew-hating savages. If that were true, if Arabs just hate Jews and can't be reasoned with at all, then Israel acknowledging the Nakba and acknowledging the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians wouldn't change that hostility at all, right? Even if they acknowledged the Nakba, the Arabs would have the same level of hostility because they're irrational. Their hostility is irrational. It has nothing to do with the Nakba, it has everything to do with hating Jews. Do you buy that? Does that sound true to you? Because to me, it seems a little off.
Argument 3. What about the Jewish refugees fleeing the Arab world? This argument took the most research to unpack. So buckle up, kids, we're going for a ride. It is true that there were significant Jewish populations living in the Arab world. There were about 800,000 Jewish people living in the Arab world before 1948, most of which were living in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Iraq. We'll save Iraq for later and first focus on North Africa. In Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, Jews did not face mass expulsion, asset confiscation, or any other large-scale government persecution. There was never a mass expulsion of Jews in these countries. Generally speaking, under the Ottoman Empire, there was a live and let live policy, and this continued in this area after the Ottomans. As long as you didn't threaten power directly, you could live. You could convert, even. Promoting Zionism was allowed, and even Zionists promoting emigration to Palestine was allowed. Living in integrated communities was normal, for the most part. If a Jew in these countries lived in a rural area, they were poor, just like everyone else living in that area. And if a Jewish person lived in an urban area, they tended to be elite. Their lives were materially shaped by location and class, not so much by religion. Towns were integrated such that you really couldn't tell who was a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian. This was not a paramount part of their identity. As Ilan Pappé puts it, in this time, they were just Moroccans who happened to be Jewish. They were just Algerians who happened to be Jewish. They were just Tunisians who happened to be Jewish. But after World War I, Zionism grew as an international political force, and this saw their Jewish identity shift to the forefront. Zionists assert that you're not a Moroccan who happens to be a Jew. You're a Jew who happens to be Moroccan. You're a Jew who happens to be Algerian. You're a Jew who happens to be Tunisian. Your Jewish identity comes first and foremost. This Jewish identity makes you different, unique, distinct. Putting this Jewish identity in the forefront shifted their collective thinking, making the idea of moving to Palestine more appealing, more affirming to their identity. Not only are you special because you are a Jew, but there is a place ordained by God Himself for you to live. You will never fully belong in Morocco or Algeria or wherever. Because you are a Jew, you will only ever fully belong in the land of Israel. Many people bought into it, which is terribly sad, because these countries were made so much more vibrant and diverse and wonderful with their Jewish populations there. They were a part of the fabric in those countries for thousands of years. And now their presence in those countries would dwindle to a mere few thousand. Now Iraq is a little different. Iraq is home to the oldest Jewish community in the world, over 3,000 years old. Jewish people in Iraq tended to be a little more well-off than their North African companions, so it was a little harder to convince them to leave. Yes, there's a promised land just for you, but why go there when you have everything you need right here? But the 1947 Partition Plan changed things. Iraq's Foreign Minister, Fadel Jamal, gave an address in New York following the adoption of the Partition Plan.
Partition imposed against the will of the majority of the people will jeopardize peace and harmony in the Middle East. Not only the uprising of the Arabs of Palestine is to be expected, but the masses in the Arab world cannot be restrained. The Arab-Jewish relationship in the Arab world will greatly deteriorate. There are more Jews in the Arab world outside of Palestine than there are in Palestine. In Iraq alone, we have about 150,000 Jews who share with Muslims and Christians all the advantages of political and economic rights. Harmony prevails among Muslims, Christians, and Jews, but any injustice opposed upon the Arabs of Palestine will disrupt the harmony among Jews and non-Jews in Iraq. It will breed interreligious prejudice and hatred.
Admittedly, things did get worse for the Jews in Iraq, especially after the establishment of Israel. Jews were persecuted, intimidated, barred from immigrating to Israel, sometimes even killed. This was a bad time to be a Jew in Iraq. But the exodus of the Jews from Iraq wasn't happening fast enough. Remember, at this time, the whole area of Israel-Palestine was only 33% Jewish. They needed more Jewish people in there, fast, preferably Jews with money. So the Zionists hatched a devastating idea. They would bomb Jewish areas in Baghdad with the aim to terrorize but not kill the Jewish population, convincing them that they would be safer if they moved to Israel. Between 1950 and 1951, Jewish businesses, neighborhoods, a library, a cultural center, a home, and a synagogue were bombed in Baghdad by the Iraqi Zionist underground. 3 or 4 Iraqi Jews were killed, and dozens were wounded. The Zionists had launched a terror campaign against the Iraqi Jews. But how do we know this? Well, the Iraqi government caught the perpetrators. The police report has been studied by many historians, including Avi Shleim, and confirms that at least some of the perpetrators were part of the Iraqi Zionist underground. Avi Shleim even interviewed a former member of the Iraqi Zionist underground in 2017, a man named Yaakov Karkukli, who confirmed that they were given maps, intelligence, grenades, TNT, and instructions to terrorize but not kill the Jewish population in Baghdad. Of course, Israel denies these claims, blaming Iraqi nationalists for the bombings. The problem, though, is that Israel tried a similar bombing campaign in Egypt in 1954 and were caught almost immediately. This incident was named the Lavon Affair after Israeli Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon. A Knesset member speaking to Lavon quotes him as saying,
"This method of operating was not invented for Egypt. It was tried before in Iraq."
Israel admitted to its involvement in the Lavon Affair in 2005. So, according to Israel, they definitely did this secret bombing campaign in Egypt in 1954, but they had nothing to do with the nearly identical secret bombing campaign in Iraq just 3 years earlier. But anyway, back to Iraq. The Iraqi Jews were scared, and about 110,000 of them fled Iraq, most of them moving to Israel.
As a contextual coincidence, that's the same number of Palestinians who fled to Lebanon in 1948. 110,000.
So, yes, there were Jewish people fleeing the Arab world during this time, some genuinely escaping violence and persecution, and some buying into Zionist arguments and choosing to start a new life in the Promised Land. Between 1948 and 1951, about 260,000 Jews left the Arab world and immigrated to Israel. But again, they were never expelled from North Africa. For the most part, the Jews left North Africa after massive efforts by the Zionists to convince them to leave, and after anti-Jewish riots broke out in response to the Nakba. Also, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia were only a few years away from their wars of independence, fighting off the French settler colonialism. They knew how settler colonialism sucked for the native population. Jews faced much greater violence and persecution in Iraq, but they were also more established and well off, with ancient ties to the place, making it harder to convince them to move. So the Zionists bombed them, bombed their neighborhoods and homes in an effort to convince them to leave. They helped create the Jewish refugee, having a solution already prepared. Move to Israel. You'll be safer there. We promise.
Hey, editing Kara here. I want to give a little more credit to the Iraqi Jews because, yeah, it seems like there's ample proof that the Zionists were part of the turmoil they were facing, but I can't in good faith say that this was the majority of the turmoil. Iraq took a hard stance against Zionism. They made Zionism illegal after May 1948, and this led to widespread discrimination and persecution of the Jews there. It was genuinely bad. I do not want to minimize the pain and suffering that the Iraqi Jews or any other Jewish refugees faced during this time. I truly cannot imagine it. It is such a sadness. Not only have I done research about refugees in the past, but I have also worked with refugees personally for many years, people from all over the world, and I really do care about them. It never fails to sadden and concern me that these people were forced to flee their homes. I'm genuinely interested in the well-being of refugees everywhere and in assuring that we have global policies in place so that these people aren't made refugees in the first place. I do not blame the Iraqi Jews for moving to Israel, just as I don't blame Eastern European Jews fleeing the pogroms for moving to Israel, or any European Jew fleeing the Holocaust for moving to Israel. I think that, given the circumstances, it makes a lot of sense that these people would choose to do that. I understand that. Secondly, Jews had very good reason to be concerned about living in Iraq during World War II. Iraq technically gained its independence from the British in 1932, but the Brits still had influence over Iraq's new monarchy. 4 years later, in 1936, there was a coup, and this helped set the stage for the government to become less pro-British and more pro-Nazi Germany. Iraqi nationalists were eager to throw off the yoke of British imperial rule and align themselves with the Nazis. The British would reinstate their power over Iraq by helping to overthrow this government in 1941. In this time, Hitler's race theory was proliferated in Iraq, specifically by reading Mein Kampf in Arabic on the radio. It is debated how much this ideology was being internalized and reflected by the public domain in Iraq, and how much it was just being parroted by the government in power. Generally speaking, it seems that anti-Semitism was much more of an issue in the European populace and European politics than it was in the Middle East. I mean, again, the intensity of anti-Semitism in the Arab world was pretty dormant until the 20th century, when the rise of the British and French mandate systems, the rise of racist fascism, and the rise of Zionism ignited major issues in the Middle East that could be easily explained away with anti-Semitic arguments. In a span of just 2 decades, these people were facing massive affronts to their lives and land, and anti-Semites could capitalize on that. Iraq was more open to Nazi propaganda than the rest of the Middle East because they weren't under direct control of the French or the British, especially in that 1936 to 41 span. Later on, Nazi propaganda would enter the Middle East more after Vichy France was established. So we have more Nazi propaganda being pumped into the Middle East, and then we come to photographs like these. The picture you see here is a very notorious picture. It is a picture of Adolf Hitler and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini. The Grand Mufti is a religious position, a leader for Palestinian Muslims. Al-Husseini was a religious and political leader in Jerusalem since the 1920s, and he was an avid anti-Zionist. He played a key role in the Great Palestinian Revolt of 1936, arguing that the British should get out of Palestine and stop supporting the Zionist cause that was encroaching on their homes. There's an often stated rumor that the Nazis financed and armed the Palestinians during this revolt, but that is patently not true. There's also a rumor that al-Husseini gave Hitler the idea for the final solution, which is also not true. Because of his role in the revolt, the British issued a warrant for al-Husseini's arrest in 1937, and so he fled. He fled to Nazi Germany, and he found that the Nazis also took issue with the British and the communists and the Jews, just like he did, and so they teamed up. The Jewish people and the Zionists were becoming synonymous, and that is a very dangerous thing indeed. But it's not like Hitler entirely loved al-Husseini and his cause. I mean, Nazis definitely deemed Arabs as inferior. Hitler himself called them half-apes. And the Nazis definitely killed a number of Arabs during the Second World War. But they would hear and respect when an anti-British powerful Arab was willing to sing their praises. The Germans felt slighted in the aftermath of World War I, and Guess who else felt slighted in the aftermath of World War I? That's right, the Arabs of the now defunct Ottoman Empire struggling under the Mandate system. There was a common resentment against the British and the French that they shared. And perhaps the Mufti was relieved that finally, someone in the West was hearing him out, hearing the cry for Palestine. I don't know. I personally don't know enough about this. I am not a historian. Ilan Pappé did not go into this specifically, and this video is getting too damn long as it is. However, from what I do know, al-Husseini was kicked out of Jerusalem by the Jordan army in 1948, never really got a grip on power again, and died in exile in the 70s. So, controversial? Absolutely. I am not a fan of this guy. He spread anti-Semitic propaganda and he met with both Hitler and Himmler during the war. After the war, the Zionists saw him as a Nazi collaborator and they wanted him dead. But Ben-Gurion was hesitant to make him a martyr for Palestine. So, instead, he lived in exile in Egypt and later Lebanon until his death in 1974, never again having significant power or public support. So, there. That is the ugly history of Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini. It's not good. But to be frank, I genuinely expected a lot worse. I didn't know much about this guy except that Zionists talk about him all the time as though he were the devil himself. Just with how much hype there is around this guy, the level of vitriol and writings about him, I was expecting a lot worse. I mean, I knew he didn't give Hitler the idea of the final solution. 1 minute on Google is all you need to clear the air there. But I was under the impression that he did more heinous things than become a nasty Nazi. Of course, this man doesn't speak for all Palestinians, either now or in 1948. He was rightfully ostracized after his collaboration with the Nazis. Good. But surprisingly, he wasn't the only one who believed that the Nazis could be their political allies. We'll get back to Herzl later. Anyway, this Nazi shit in the Arab world in the 30s and 40s was bad. It undoubtedly made the lives of the Jewish people there worse. I fundamentally denounce it. But I would like to highlight something. Hitler's race theory viewed some races as inherently inferior, and this was used as justification for their mass murder. Jews, Poles, Roma, disabled people, many more. They viewed their own race, the Aryan race, as superior, as distinct, as innately deserving of things such as life, liberty, and land over others. This type of thinking is problematic. You follow this type of thinking to its natural conclusion and suddenly you're justifying discrimination, persecution, dehumanization, expulsion, ethnic cleansing, and genocide of whatever group of people it is that you believe are not innately deserving of land or life or liberty. So you can see how Zionists adopting a similar mentality is an issue, right? Many contemporary Zionists will insist that they have not adopted a mentality of superiority similar to Hitler's, that they do see Jews as a separate race, as Hitler did, but this does not mean they believe their race is superior to other races. It's simply different. But how do we reconcile this idea that many Zionists purport they don't have superiority over others, but that they do believe that they have the right to a homeland in Israel-Palestine on the basis of their race, and that due to the inconvenient fact that there are still millions of non-Jewish people living in Israel-Palestine, Zionists assert that they have a greater claim to this land because of their race. Is that not superiority? A superior claim to a land and the life lived on that land based upon someone's inborn race? I mean, this sounds kind of racist, right? It reminds me of the testimony of Stefan Kapos, a Hungarian Jew who was sent to Auschwitz at the tender age of 7 and relocated to the UK after Auschwitz was liberated. He spoke of his cousin who also survived the camp and moved to Israel after she was liberated. In May of 2024, he said,
Yet she came back to Israel, and first to Romania and then Israel, and she was as racist as the rest of them against the Palestinians. Now, it's beyond understanding how you can do that, and with the background that she had. I think this is to do with the extreme propaganda and the dehumanization. Zionism was a very unfortunate and sad development for the Jewish people. It broke a much longer tradition of always being on the side of the oppressed, not the oppressor, and the charitable nature of the Judaism and the humanity that they advocate, into a kind of exceptionalism and nationalism.
Everything is the Jews, not a single piece for other people, only for us.
This testimony highlights how there were Jews who survived the Holocaust and emigrated to places where Zionism was not the governing ideology, and were shocked to see the racism that it brought out in their family members who did move to Israel. You can only keep up the charade that this exceptionalism and nationalism is not racist for so long. Not only do we see the racism in regard to Palestinians, but we also see it within the Israeli Jewish community. Israeli Jews are diverse. They have come from all over the world. They don't all look the same. And this unspoken backbone of racism and Zionist ideology has had real-life consequences for different groups of Israeli Jews. Specifically, Jews from Europe with whiter skin, Ashkenazi Jews, have had significantly more economic prosperity and political dominance than darker-skinned Jews from the Middle East or North Africa, Mizrahi Jews. And this tension persists to this day. French-Israeli sociologist Eva Illouz wrote in her 2023 book, The Emotional Life of Populism, which I cannot recommend enough, about this cleavage between Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews.
Mizrahim are Jews who immigrated to Israel from Africa and Asia, mostly in the 1940s and 50s, as well as their descendants. They immigrated from countries such as Morocco, Iraq, Yemen, and many others. It is now beyond dispute that these Jews were significantly discriminated against by what was then a socialist left-wing establishment composed almost exclusively of Ashkenazim, which are Eastern and Western European Jews, who, like many of their non-Jewish European counterparts, held deeply Orientalist views of Arabs and, by association, of Mizrahim as well. They regarded them as primitive and inimical to the Western project that Israel was trying to implement in the Middle East. The discrimination against Mizrahim took many forms. After the founding of the state in 1948, the Israeli government created transit camps to house the tide of incoming migrants. In many cases, the camps included tents and shabby huts with no electricity or running water. Ashkenazi immigrants were usually taken out of the camps fairly quickly and housed in what became urban centers and proper neighborhoods, while Mizrahi immigrants typically had to stay in the camps much longer, sometimes for several years, even organizing a new identity around these camps. In 1952, over 80% of people living in these transit camps, or ma'abarot as they were called, were Mizrahim, which generated a significant gap in the conditions of integration and mobility of the two ethnic groups. The education system in Israel favored Ashkenazim as well. Mizrahim were clearly at a disadvantage. In the 1970s, only 27% of Mizrahi boys attended high schools. More glaringly, Mizrahi pupils were more likely to be steered towards vocational schools and prevented from gaining a full high school diploma. Many of the towns dominated by Mizrahim did not have regular high schools, which of course de facto prevented them from entering the universities, which after the 1970s throughout the world became the surest path to social mobility. The discrimination, Orientalism, and unapologetic dismissal of Mizrahim by Ashkenazim are beyond doubt, despite the fact that these have been sorely and vehemently contested.
So, yes, a contemporary Zionist may argue that they are not superior due to their race, but they certainly have a right to the land over others who are not of their race, and they certainly have a racist society within their own nation. Israel is not racist, but the whiter Israeli Jews happen to be more powerful and well-off. The Jewish race is not superior, but theirs was the one race chosen by God to be his people on this land. And if you push back against the government of this land, you are pushing back against God himself. And you're definitely an anti-Semite. Super duper quick clarification. I am not attacking Jews for believing that they're God's chosen people. It's actually a really beautiful belief that they have, that God gives them the mission to live the most ethical lives they can, that non-Jews can also have a deep relationship with God, that the vast history of Jewish suffering means Jews have a unique understanding of suffering and a unique responsibility to quell suffering in the world. I truly find this part of Judaism quite lovely. But the belief gets manipulated and mutated by some people who believe that they are better, they are righteous, they are so moral that they are incapable of wrongdoing, and thus this poignant part of Judaism is co-opted for Israeli national interests. It turns ugly and racist real fast. It sucks. I just can't foresee a world where the sense of racial superiority with righteous pretenses doesn't lead to race-based issues down the road. Discrimination, dehumanization, ethnic cleansing, genocide, you get it. It seems that these things are logical conclusions of any ethnocentric ideology, as long as the proponents of that ideology have the power to enact race-based violence. But I want to highlight that Jews had lived in the Arab world for thousands of years, longer than anywhere else in the history of the world, and they were more than able to live side by side with Arabs and Christians and Muslims and Druze and many others. This was able to happen because they didn't have ideologies of ethnic superiority dominating the land like we see today. It wasn't like the Arabs woke up one day in 1948 and realized that they hated Jews, but they were witnessing the increasing power of the Zionist movement and how Jewish people and international superpowers were buying into it, and how this was really bad for the Arabs, for the non-Jews, especially after the Nakba. I guess you could argue that the expulsion of 73% of Iraq's Jews is similar to the Nakba, which is horrible, but at least they had somewhere to go.
And so, after thousands of years of cohabitation with Jews and Muslims and Christians and Arabs and Druze and what have you, we have this nasty race theory muddying the waters. And what a stinky mess that is.
Argument 4. This land was promised to the Jews by the UN, the British, and God. Okay, so I think I've already shown how the partition plan was unfair. I think we can all agree that the most fair thing would have been to let the people living there democratically vote for what they think is best, but the Zionists couldn't let that happen because they were in a clear minority. But they were a powerful minority because they had the backing of imperial powerhouses like the British, which leads me to the Balfour Declaration. I'm not going to go too in-depth here. I think Big Joel explains it well enough in this video. Go check it out. Long story short, in 1917, the UK's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter promising the area of Palestine to the Jewish people once they defeated the Ottomans and took over Palestine. What's interesting to note about Balfour is that he clearly was aware of the violence and persecution Jews were facing in Eastern Europe at this time, and he knew that this would cause an influx of Jewish refugees. But he didn't want these refugees in Britain, so he helped pass the Alien Act of 1905, restricting their immigration. So we have these Jews that are fleeing and they need somewhere to go. Why not Palestine? Sure, why not? Here's the declaration with my support. The Zionists were thrilled! They had international support, and from an empire to boot. At the time the letter was written, Palestine was 94% Palestinian and only 6% Jewish. Woof. Some Brits were shocked by this letter, including British Jews, and they warned that it would have two devastating effects. Number one, it would be a catastrophe for the Palestinians, and two, it would be a catastrophe for the Jews in Europe.
Point 1 is pretty obvious. The Palestinians would lose their home so that the Jewish settlers would gain one. Point 2 takes a little more thought. The Jews are facing anti-Semitism in Europe, and for that they are suffering. The solution Balfour proposes is not dealing with the anti-Semitism, but rather taking the victim of it and pushing them somewhere else. We can't hate the Jews if there are no Jews here to hate. You can see how this is a problem, right? They would rather send the Jews to a faraway place they've never been than deal with the fact that they hate Jews. Anti-Semitism is permitted to stay. The Jews are permitted to go away. This inability to challenge anti-Semitism, to permit it even, might make it fester, might make it lead to something a lot more insidious down the road. That's foreshadowing. World War I ends, the Ottoman Empire collapses, and the British take control of Palestine. Now, under Ottoman law, after the 1867 land law, foreigners could purchase Ottoman-controlled land. But the large-scale displacement of the people on that land was prohibited. Zionists couldn't buy large swaths of land in Palestine and kick out the Palestinians. The Zionist project couldn't work under the Ottoman Empire. However, the British offered no such protections. So, in the 1920s and 1930s, the Zionists began buying large amounts of land in Palestine. Over half of the owners didn't even live in Palestine. Many lived in Beirut, and they were happy to cash a fat check and ignore the consequences. So, according to Ilan Pappé, 11 Palestinian villages were liquidated this way. In this time, Zionists began more direct talks of the transfer of the Palestinians. In other words, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was gradually taking place under the protection of British imperial rule. In other words, fuck the British. Now, something I have heard time and time again by the Zionists is that this land was promised to them by God. It is written in the Old Testament. But here's the thing. The Old Testament is not a law book. It is a collection of religious texts with teachings about morality. It can be used to understand history, but it is not a historical text in itself. Yes, it is true. Thousands of years ago, Jews lived in Palestine, and this fact is recorded in the Old Testament. But how does that translate into modern Jews from all across the world, predominantly in Europe and North America, getting the right at birth to move to Palestine? I mean, my dad's Roman Catholic. Do I gain the right at birth to move to Jerusalem, or the Vatican, or any other integral part of my religion's history and claim that my home is there now? No. That's silly. Ancient religious history doesn't get to play a role in modern policy making. Religious texts are not legal doctrines. I mean, what do we say about Muslims that believe the Quran should be legal doctrine? We say that those people are extremists, that they threaten progress and democracy, and that they're promoting a bad idea. What do we say about Christians that believe the Bible should be legal doctrine? We say that they're extremists, fundamental bigots, promoting a bad idea. So when Zionists say that there needs to be a Jewish state and it needs to be in Palestine because it says so in the Old Testament, why do we say, sure, yeah, that's okay, fine, yeah. Let's zoom out a little. The very idea that there is one Judaism and that one true Judaism promotes the idea of Israel is preposterous, right? I mean, is there such thing as one true Christianity? Is there such thing as one true Islam? No! There are dozens, if not hundreds of sects who believe vastly different things. They disagree on many key issues. The idea that the true Judaism is one that promotes the Jewish state of Israel is preposterous. I mean, some of the biggest pushback to the Zionist project, both historically and today, has come from Orthodox Jews. Are those people not true Jews because they speak against the state of Israel? No, that's silly. Furthermore, over 20% of Israel's population today isn't Jewish. Over 2 million people in Israel aren't Jewish. Why should they be the subject to the whims and testaments of the Jewish God? I think we can all agree that in a modern world, a world where we want to promote democracy, it's misguided to say that a group of people gets to do something because God says so. Bad argument. No, thank you.
Argument 5. The Jewish people needed a safe place to go after the Holocaust. So, obviously, after the Holocaust, the argument for Zionism became a lot more appealing. This never would have happened if the Jews were together, protected in large numbers. The state of Israel is needed now more than ever. And emotionally, I understand this argument. I understand how it feels like it makes sense. But with critical thinking, it breaks down easily. So let's talk about it. To start, we've already talked before about how things like the Balfour Declaration appeased both Zionists and anti-Semites. We don't like these people, so let's get them out of here and then everyone will be happy. This segregation permits discrimination to run rampant, which can escalate into violence, into genocide. You know who knew this? Theodor Herzl, the forefather of Zionism. Herzl believed that anti-Semitism comes from Jews living with non-Jewish people. Here are his words.
The Jewish question exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not exist, it is carried by Jews in the course of their migration. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism into England. They have already introduced it into America.
So, according to Herzl, the only way to truly protect oneself from anti-Semitism was to congregate in a powerful state. And this idea of a state would be promoted by anti-Semitic states. He says,
the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries our allies.
That excerpt is from Mauschel, or The Mouse, an anti-Semitic rant that Herzl published under a pseudonym, arguing why anti-Zionist Jews are disgusting. Not cool. This idea that anti-Semitic countries are Zionist allies was not only seen with the British, but also with Nazi Germany. In August 1933, the Nazis and the Zionist German Jews signed the Havara Agreement, permitting 60,000 German Jews to immigrate to Palestine. Now, those 60,000 people got to live, got to avoid the Holocaust, and I am genuinely happy for that. That is undoubtedly a good thing. But knowing that the foundations of Zionism depend on anti-Semitism, that Herzl was eager to be allies and cooperate with anti-Semites is deeply concerning. One could make the argument that Zionism couldn't exist without anti-Semitism, and therefore, Zionism is uninterested in extinguishing anti-Semitism. They need it to justify their argument for a state. And that's bad. Any argument that needs anti-Semitism to support it is bad. I am not saying that the Holocaust was the fault of the Zionists. No, I'm saying that the Holocaust was able to happen in part because of the acceptance and proliferation of anti-Semitism, which is why we must challenge and eradicate anti-Semitism, or any ideology that asserts that one group of people is superior or inferior to another. And Zionism, at its core, is ethnocentric. That is why I condemn it. After the Holocaust, there was an immense amount of guilt across Europe, as the world learned of, or actually acknowledged, what had happened. And with this guilt came a desire to do something for the Jewish people. This feeling, this incredibly understandable feeling, helped lead to the creation of Israel. Europe said, "Oof, sorry about that. Is there any way we can make it up to you? You want a state? Sure, here you go. A place just for you where you know you will be safe." But here's the thing. Israel is not a safe place. It is, in fact, very dangerous. Israel has been in a state of emergency since 1948, since the day it was created. The people Israel conquered, they segregated, they fenced in, they massacred. Those people are still there. They haven't killed them all yet. And those people are still fighting back, are still fighting for their freedom. And as long as those people are denied their freedom, Israel will not be a safe place to live. The Zionist promise for safety, it failed. It failed because there is no safety without freedom.
Part 4. Summary. So there you have it, a rough estimation of the Zionist counter-narrative of 1948 and my response to it. Let's review. Number 1. 1948 was a war of self-defense, but the ethnic cleansing of Palestine started months before the declaration of war. Number 2. This wouldn't have happened if the Arab states had accepted the Partition Plan. But the Partition Plan was decidedly unfair for the Palestinians, and this is not a justification for the crimes of the Nakba. Number 3. The Jewish refugees needed somewhere to go, but they were never expelled from North Africa and were fleeing violence in Iraq made in part by secret Zionist plots. Number 4. The establishment of Israel was guaranteed by the Partition Plan, the Balfour Declaration, and God. But these things had little to no consideration for the Palestinians or have no place in policymaking. Number 5. The Jews needed a safe place to go after the Holocaust. But Israel is not a safe place for Jewish people. It is, in fact, an extremely dangerous place for Jewish people. And that is in large part because Israel forbids the freedom of nearly 8 million Palestinians living there. During his visit, Ilan Pappé discussed the making of his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He talked about how his publisher was hesitant to use that title. However, Ilan began writing his book in the year 2000, the same time that the U.S. State Department was publishing articles regarding the ethnic cleansing that had taken place in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And so, we have this concrete definition of ethnic cleansing endorsed by the U.S. By using their very definition of ethnic cleansing, and by providing the irrefutable evidence of what happened to the Palestinians in 1948, the publishers had no choice but to conclude that the title was appallingly apropos. So, if that is true, if there is irrefutable evidence that Israel committed ethnic cleansing in the Nakba, then why do so many Israeli Jews and worldwide Zionists deny it to this day? Well, there's a few reasons. Zionism had some powerhouse support early on. Support from the Christian Zionists, from the British Empire, from the European nations guilty after the Holocaust, from the multinational military and security complex, and the U.S., who is eager to bolster Israel as the USSR bolstered the Arab states during the Cold War. This powerful alliance is integral in Israel being able to deny what happened in 1948. With friends like these, who needs to face the truth? There is also the simple fact that in 2011, Israel passed the Nakba law. Basically, if you refer to what happened in 1948 as the Nakba, it is a federal crime. The Israeli Ministry of Finance has the legal right to withhold state money from you. For example, if you go to a university and refer to the Nakba, either you won't get paid or, more likely, your event will be canceled. This is particularly interesting because you have one hand denying that the Nakba ever happened, while you have the other hand threatening another Nakba. Take a look here. didn't used to be like this. It didn't used to be this open. This level of rhetoric is new. It comes from decades of dehumanization. It comes from decades of the international community doing nothing about it. It comes from the government shifting to the right. And frankly, it's terrifying. Oh, and the Nakba law? None of these men were charged. Stopping rhetoric like this is not why the Nakba law exists. There's also the simple fact that knowledge is power, and Israel controls that knowledge. Of course, Israel controls who can be a guest speaker at a university in Israel. But they also have that power in the West Bank. Technically, they don't have that power in Gaza anymore because there are no more universities in Gaza. They control who can become a professor, who can remain a professor. So professors who teach the narrative of ethnic cleansing are ostracized, threatened, fired. Students who discuss the narrative of ethnic cleansing are suspended, threatened, expelled. Ilan Pappé himself was asked to resign from Haifa University by the Israeli Minister of Education. He was accused in a 10-page indictment of being disloyal and unpatriotic. He was harassed in endless phone calls, sent feces in the mail, and given numerous death threats, both privately and publicly. He had to leave. Even though he is an Israeli Jew, the top of the hierarchy in Israeli society, for the narrative he was teaching, he had to leave. He's still allowed to visit home, but he has been entirely expelled from Israeli academia. He's like banned from all Israeli high schools. Like, what the fuck? He even told this ridiculous story where he was moving from one Israeli town to another and word got out that he was moving to this new town, and so that local newspaper published a story about how he was moving there. And like, look out, this dangerous man is moving to our town. Like, if you met this guy, I think you could see how hilarious this is. He is the most harmless person I've ever met. Anyway. Universities are an effective way to challenge settler colonialism and occupation. Therefore, they are a threat. So, to mitigate this threat, Israel controls the narrative, and Ilan Pappé's research and teachings are a threat to that narrative. Another reason Israeli Jews and Zionist supporters deny the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is because it's an existential threat to Israel's existence. If this really happened, if Israel was really founded on its settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing, how do they reconcile with that fact today? Let's look at the U.S. as an example. Today, in an American classroom, students will learn about the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Native Americans by American settlers and the American government. This was not always the case. Back when Native Americans were still a security threat to the U.S., back when we were still actively fighting and killing them, we weren't talking about how we were committing a genocide. Of course not. We needed to kill them to complete step 2 of settler colonialism, dealing with the native population. We were justifying and rationalizing and moralizing it until they weren't a threat to our expansion anymore. And only after that point, and sometime after, could we take a step back and say, whoa, look what we've done. This was perhaps not great. Now, if we had paused to say that as it was happening, as we were becoming a country and expanding as a country, how would we justify our country's existence, its expansion? It would be a lot harder, right? Perhaps impossible. Additionally, Israel has some of the most powerful lobbyist groups in the world. Certainly more powerful than literally all the Palestinian lobbyist groups put together.
If you want to learn more about that specifically, I suggest that you check out the video here. Ilan Pappé discusses his new 500-page book on the pro-Israel lobby. Israel has fantastic propaganda and fantastic PR. They have popularized their narrative through Hollywood. Here are just a few examples you can look into. Israel has also authenticated their narrative through academia, a topic that I will cover in a future video. I cannot begin to tell you how many times I have been told by people that they don't talk about this because it is simply too complicated. This is what they want you to say. They have carefully crafted a sophisticated and hard to understand narrative of what happened. No, they'll tell you. This isn't ethnic cleansing. There are a million things that you aren't considering. This situation is too complicated, too historical for you to grasp. And a lot of people buy that. A lot of people are afraid to talk because it's complicated. Blah. To which I ask, which massive system of injustice isn't complicated? Slavery is complicated. Apartheid is complicated. Genocide is complicated. Does that mean we ought not breach the topic? Ought not trust the things that we do know about it? Ought not take the things that we know and fight against it? That's the reason I'm here. I want to break it down and make it understandable for the average lay person. I want you to feel confident enough in what you do know to do something about it. I believe that we can make this end. They didn't have smartphones in the Nakba, but we do now. Anyway, I'll get back to my script. Lastly, one of the craziest things I learned was that in August 1948, Israel began an operation that Ilan Pappé has called memricide, a process meant to erase any remnants of Palestinian existence in Palestine. So you know how Israel wiped out whole Palestinian villages and cities and towns? Israel built colonies over those destroyed towns, often giving them a Hebrew name that is similar to the original Arabic name. This is how Seforia became Zippori, and Lubia became Lavi. As Ilan Pappé puts it,
the idea was to say that these were actually ancient biblical places, and therefore this was not a destruction of village, but rather the redemption and the return to the villages.
Some towns just had trees planted on top of them, but not the olive trees, not the trees that were indigenous to the land, but pine trees. 10,000 pine trees imported from Europe. Unsurprisingly, these trees didn't make it. We tend to think that indoctrinated societies only exist under dictatorships, but that simply is not true. Israeli society is not under a dictatorship, yet they are indeed indoctrinated into believing that a vibrant Palestine never existed at all. This alternative narrative to 1948 is not an accident. It was carefully crafted to permit the Zionist project to carry on. This alternative narrative is so entrenched in Israeli society that I don't think it's possible for it to change from the inside. We must learn of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. We must declare that we know the truth, because that will never happen inside Israel. That is why you being here is so important. Part 5, Epilogue. Right before I met Ilan Pappé, I went to Auschwitz. I've always been interested in the Holocaust. I'm of Polish descent, and I had a relative who was tortured in the concentration camp. I knew her, and knowing her as a child left a deep impression on me. Auschwitz was a concentration camp turned death camp where over 1 million people were systematically murdered. Auschwitz was toured and approved of by the Red Cross, and though they didn't see the true nature of what was happening there, this gave it international credibility. One of the first stops on the tour shows you the rhetoric about Jews leading up to the Holocaust. So you can see how they were dehumanized and how that, in turn, led to their mass murder. Some examples being Jews are rats, Jews are lice, Jews are snakes, Jews are the worst plague of all. As Dr. Pappé says, once you dehumanize a group of people, you don't need to justify killing them. Their inhumanity is the justification. We need to be extremely cautious and considerate when making parallels to the Holocaust. Emotions run high, especially with something so devastating and cognitively unfathomable as the Holocaust. I understand these emotions, and I know it's tricky territory to discern when those parallels are legitimate and when they're not. I think you can make parallels without being thoughtful. So if someone is constantly calling their enemies and opponents Hitler and Nazis, I think we should be skeptical of that. But not only do I believe that parallels to the Holocaust can be thoughtfully made, but they're supposed to. That is why we have studied the Holocaust and the mechanisms that led to it, so we can understand how it happened so it will never happen again. So that when we see something similar to the telltale signs of genocide, we can recognize it and point it out. Suffice it to say that when I was in that room in Auschwitz looking at the walls of rhetoric about how Jews are subhuman and how that subhuman status justifies the violence being enacted against them, I thought of the dehumanization of the Palestinians today. How normal it is to read things like this and this and this and this and this and this today. Of course, it's been going on for a long time, but it's become increasingly prevalent both in Israeli politics and in the public at large. To which a Zionist might say, and the Palestinians do it too. They say dehumanizing things about Jews too. Why don't you say anything about that? And it's like, yeah, you're not wrong. Some Palestinians have said horrible things about Jews, and I think that that is wrong. But I have 3 things to say in response. Number 1, anti-Semitism exists both in anti-Zionist circles and in Zionist circles. Many Christian Zionists perpetuate anti-Semitism in the same breath that they support Israel. Theodor Herzl, the forefather of Zionism, perpetuated dehumanization of Jews. If you are opposed to anti-Semitism as a principle, as I am, but you ignore it when it benefits Israel, then I question whether it's really the anti-Semitism you have a problem with. Number 2, a lot of statements by Palestinians with dehumanizing rhetoric are levied against Zionism and Israel, and though I don't agree with the use of dehumanizing language, I think it's important to be aware of this distinction, of the fact that a lot of Palestinian frustration and hatred is levied not toward Jews on the basis of their religion, but rather is directed toward this political ideology and political entity that has destroyed their lives. I mean, if a Jew in the 1930s said that all Germans are pigs or whatever, though I want to say that that speech is conducive for lasting peace between the Jews and the Germans, I would understand it a lot more than I would if a German used dehumanizing language against the Jews. And that's because of number 3, the power difference. The Palestinians never committed a Nakba against the Jews. They didn't. They couldn't. They can't. They don't have that kind of power over Israel. And even way back when they far outnumbered the Jewish settlers, even then, they didn't do a Nakba. They didn't liquidate villages. They didn't destroy entire towns. Yes, there were clashes. Yes, there was violence sometimes, but they didn't do that. They tried to live in peace the vast majority of the time. They tried to live together and make it work. Dehumanization is bad. Period. But it is materially worse when it is wielded by an entity in power. And so, all of this said, I want to contemplate the very existence of the counter-narrative, the very existence of an alternative narrative to the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 1948. Because, okay, maybe you could argue that there's something inherently valuable in having an alternative narrative, that there's something to be gained from differing perspectives. And yet, in the case of the Holocaust, the existence of an alternative narrative is completely unacceptable. So unacceptable, in fact, that it is specifically illegal to deny or minimize the Holocaust in Austria, Germany, Czechia, Poland, Belgium, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Greece, Italy, France, and Israel. And yet, an alternative narrative to the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians is not only acceptable, but it's normal. It's a legitimate position to have. And I'm genuinely curious why that is. I genuinely want people to question why that is. In Auschwitz, we were told the words of Auschwitz survivor Marian Tursky. Auschwitz did not fall suddenly from the skies. It was all tiny steps approaching until what happened here behind me did happen. I think part of the reason people struggle to reckon with what is happening to the Palestinians today is because we've all completely ignored all of those tiny steps. And so, in divulging what happened in 1948, I hope to unveil people's disbelief in how it could be so bad today. 1948 was so bad, and the whole world ignored it. 1948 was a catastrophe, and Israel never had to pay for it. What makes it any different now?
If you made it this far, I want to thank you very much for watching. Feel free to comment with something new you learned in this video. I researched everything in this video, and you can find my citations in the description. My name is Kara, and I care about history acknowledged. See you next time.